Unitarians, essentially, like, I'm the problem because I went public about Reverend Ray Drennan's intolerant and abusive behavior after, trying to get it settled internally, for 2.5 years. I finally went public and protested outside the church and got some newspaper reports as a result. That, I should add, my protest began in May of 1998, so more than a year earlier, almost a year and a half earlier before I was permanently expelled. And I should add that my protest started after I'd been kicked out for 6 months previously. Essentially what happened is, at some point, about 1.5 years or so after I complained about Reverend Ray Drennan's anti-religious intolerance and bigotry, which caused him to slander an interreligious event that I'd organized as a cult, label me psychotic because I'm claiming a quite profound religious experience, and dismiss my religious beliefs as being nothing but silliness and fantasy, because we're talking about an intolerant atheist here. I complained about this. I sought a retraction and an apology, and essentially I was ignored and brushed off and dismissed by the board of the Unitarian Church of Montreal. The Unitarian Universalist Association even had the unmitigated gall to say that Reverend Ray Drennan's behavior, as I described it in considerably more detail in my letter of grievance, was within the appropriate guidelines of ministerial leadership. So essentially saying, he didn't do anything wrong, it's all within the guidelines, which it wasn't. But nevertheless, they just completely dismissed it. They completely whitewashed them. And so, I even after being dismissed, by the board and so on and the UUA, I continued to air my grievances. I shared letters of grievance with congregation members after services had ended. So after a service ended, I would, just calmly, quietly distribute letters of grievance to church members, letting them know there was a problem and seeking their assistance in resolving the issue. So about as peaceful as you can be in terms of dealing with, what by then was already significantly oppressive behavior, not only by Reverend Ray Drennan, but by the leadership of the church and the UUA. And so at a certain point, the church set up this so-called disruptive behavior committee, and they essentially tried to pretend that my calm and peaceful distribution of letter of grievance after Sunday services was disruptive behavior, and they insisted that I could not do it anymore. Oh, what's going on here? My phone is ringing. Okay, I know who that is. I'll call them back. So that's it. So they essentially were threatening me with a 6-month expulsion if I didn't stop distributing letters of grievance to church members, after the services. They even said that, I could do it off property after the service. They said, if you want to stand outside the church and hand them out to people as they leave, that's fine, but we'll kick you out for 6 months, if you distribute them to members inside the church. So what happened? Down the road a little bit, Reverend Ray Drennan finally sent a letter of apology through the mail. And of course it was a utterly worthless non-apology apology. It actually essentially repeated the insults in the apology itself. It essentially stood by them and said I was only trying to explain my position or something like that. Well, his position was not acceptable. His position was intolerance and bigotry. And here he is sort of saying, I was only just trying to, share my opinion or whatever, So I didn't accept that apology. And I wrote a letter to the board letting them know that, well, this had happened. It's not good enough. You know, if you make sure that Drennan, delivers a proper apology, well, that will resolve the issue. Like if you make sure that he writes a better letter of apology that I can actually accept with some honor, and he delivers it publicly rather than just privately in a mail, then the issue is resolved and we can start fresh. But no, they essentially used that letter to the board, which was put in the mailboxes of the board, as a pretext for kicking me out of church for 6 months. They actually, if I remember correctly, I think there was a bit of a delay on that. I think they even delayed that by some months. It was kind of ironic because I think what happened is I didn't distribute letters of agreements to the congregation in the building for some time. But then I decided to comply with what they had said, and I stood off the church property. I stood, right around here. I think I was standing right about this area. So people were coming out of the church, and as they left, I would ask them if they would take a letter of grievance. Some did, some didn't. But I was complying 100% with what they had said when John Inder, the president of the church at the time, came out and handed me this letter suspending my membership for 6 months because ostensibly for that earlier letter to the board, that was put in the board mailboxes months earlier. I think the whole idea was to, silence me, to prevent me from, sharing my grievances with the congregation and so on. So that was like in 1997, and I took the pill. I stayed away for 6 months and came back, and when I came back I said, well, nothing's being resolved, we still have the same problems, we still need to deal with it. And there was some, how can I put it, like 1 or 2 leading members of the church did sort of indicate that they might be prepared to try and finally resolve it, but nothing happened, nothing materialized. I had previously warned the church, that if they didn't resolve the issues, that at some point I would protest publicly. I actually warned them months earlier, even I'd say more than a year before I began protesting. I warned them about this, like, hey, at some point I'm going to protest. And they just ignored that. And so in May of 1998, I began my protest. And of course, they immediately handed out another suspension, I think for 18 months or something, soon after I began protesting. Actually, when I first began protesting, I remember I would protest and then I'd come in for the service. And at a certain point, they suspended me. And that didn't end my protest. I continued to protest. So I essentially been protesting quite continuously since May 1998, other than the times that the church has managed to suppress the protest with court conditions. And going on vacation, this, that, and the other thing. I'm not protesting every Sunday, but certainly have been protesting. Let's say on average 3 Sundays a month ever since, with the exception of the times that I've been out of town. Even when I've been out of town, I've actually protested at some other Unitarian Universalist churches in Ontario and Georgia and possibly 1 or 2 other states. So certainly I protested in Boston. I protested at the headquarters of the Unitarian Universalist Association a couple of times, once in May of 2000, which was actually quite interesting how that worked out. And in 2010, I went down and 2010, and did a little protest. I was planning to do a bigger protest, but it turned out to be the Boston Marathon weekend, and I realized that you know, in terms of getting news coverage, it would be very difficult because everyone was, you know, concerned in terms of the Boston Marathon. They weren't likely to cover a protest. So I thought, you know, maybe the best thing to do would be to attend the board meeting and, you know, ask some questions at the board meeting rather than protest. And I was actually able to do that. You know, they didn't prohibit me from attending the board meeting. And so I was actually able to ask some interesting questions and make some points about problems in terms of how they handle clergy misconduct. And they actually did promise to follow up. And of course they didn't. Basically, as soon as I left the building, they went back to their stonewalling. But that's one of the things that actually annoys me is that they actually did hear what I have to say and realize there was a problem and say, yes, we will follow up on this, you know, we will get back to you, we will address this, and then of course didn't, which is typical of how the Unitarian Universalist Association operates. Just I think I need to put these in a bag, but I'm heading to the bus stop. Just don't want to miss the bus because I have other things to do, but I figured I'd narrate while the camera's still running as I'm heading to the bus. And so that's it. You know, the Unitarian Church of Montreal has certainly behaved in a manner that can be described as oppressive in multiple ways, as has the Unitarian Universalist Association. And we'll see what happens with their 8th principle.
Okay.
I'm fine, thanks. So, riding a bike asking if I'm okay. So probably because they saw me somewhat awkwardly carrying my picket signs. Anywho, I think our Sunday, 21st of November protest is reasonably successful. About an hour, a little over an hour of protest.